It needs to be said as well that the first group was very enthusiastic around the person of Lanteri. However, when Lanteri died, perhaps the most charismatic figure was Father Rinaldi. However, it seems that he had a period of personal crisis. He didn't get along with those first oblates because they came from dioceses. Most of them were diocesan from various dioceses, and they are the ones who made up the congregation. There was not much time for them to see eye to eye on things, even due to the fact that going around giving popular missions, they have little time left to really live community life. It is true that the first oblates, when they gave popular missions, were at least 3 or 4, or sometimes 5 priests, and there was a community. Today, in some instances, we no longer have communities of 3 or 4 or 5 oblates, but more like communities of 1 or 2 or 3 oblates. There was even a superior who was dedicated to the time of the popular mission, which sometimes lasted 2 weeks. There would be 10 days of the exercises plus the days of travel. In all this, the oblates were really together, staying together the whole day, working hard, sharing the same apostolate. They didn't do their own individual apostolates, and they shared their meals together too. It was a fully shared apostolate. It is clear that later on there was a drop in the demand for popular missions in Europe. Retreats in Europe, for the most part, were for the religious sisters and for the clergy. But for Lanteri, the popular missions were the spiritual exercises for the laity. The years went by, and then there was the risk of limiting the exercises. Limiting them to whom? To the priests and religious sisters. That was not the way we were thinking in the beginning, so I believe that we must always take into consideration the needs of the time, without ever losing our authentic face, revising our strategies. In our history, we see this continuous effort to do just this. So I really think that, looking back then, we really shouldn't point fingers, because that time was more or less faithful to the founder. In reality, in every era, the oblates had challenges. And they tried to face these challenges with the abilities that they had and the means at their disposal. Certainly, only after that era ended, we could say whether they succeeded or didn't succeed. Certainly their goodwill was not lacking. Even when the persecution reached France, it was a big problem. But the OMVs responded. At least some oblates were always able to respond. It's kind of curious. When I was doing my research, I saw that in times of crisis, when confronting difficulties, some oblates suffered health problems. This increased the number of sick oblates. Depending on how one reacts to problems, there is a risk of reacting to them in a physical way. In fact, it struck me that when we were suppressed, there was a large number of OMVs who died because of health problems. In the history of the congregation, there are times when some oblate shows up who was truly sent by Providence. For example, Providence directed the choice of Prenetti, a man of great pastoral sensitivity, who grew up with Berchiala in Sardinia, which was then considered to be missionary territory. The Archdiocese of Cagliari was a mission area. When he arrived in Pisa, in a village that had difficulties and was run by the communists, he saw these simple people and he found a way of restoring their faith. So he understood that, first of all, the oblates needed to help these poor people to find faith again, to find serenity. The popular mission started up again. The OMVs went through all of Tuscany to give the spiritual exercises. We must always have that ability to bless an apostolic work that is given to us, an apostolic work that enables our institute to live and to have perspective, and above all, that enables our institute to regain our enthusiasm without however, losing what is our central apostolic purpose. With the fathers who left from Tuscany, indeed, they left and gradually opened houses. They opened one in Teramo, then one in Rovereto, a student house. Then there were those fortuitous cases of someone who entered, gathered information, brought reports, and then from there the Oblates opened. Thanks to the priests from Trentino, we wound up in Austria, in Vienna, in Loreto. Gradually we opened ourselves up to new horizons. It is a continuous challenge. Sometimes there is also a need for an apostolic work that gives enthusiasm, and then from there, if one wants, one also returns. I almost feel like returning to our specific, unique mission. It takes one and the other. Sometimes it is the Marian aspect of the Oblates that impressed young men to join us. Yet at other times people always liked the fact that the OMVs were made up of many cultures put together. Actually, even from the beginning, the Oblates were not just from a certain set geographical area, but from different areas. Even if they were all from Italy, they still spoke different dialects. I was also struck by the history of Chiavari, how we had Italian and Austrian seminarians living together. Well, they were Austrians but from Trentino, which was under Austria at that time. The Italian seminarians told them, "Are you happy that now we are giving you your freedom?" And the Trentino students replied, "But we are already free." Trentino today is Italian, but our seminarians didn't consider that an issue. Even though we were from different countries, we spoke the same language. They were happy to be under the Habsburgs. For us, it was like a heresy. So even that had an effect on some OMVs. It was nice to have people from different geographical areas. Even Chiavari itself, between the two world wars. In my humble opinion, Chiavari flourished between the First and Second World Wars, and there we had young people coming from Rome, Trentino, Tuscany, and Piedmont. They were together, being trained together, and this created enthusiasm. It was also enthusiastic to see truly different people united in the single ideal. In the 1920s? Yes, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, until the outbreak of the war. Then the war shocked everyone. I believe that it is taking decades to understand how everything started from that point. I have a feeling that with World War II we had a real worsening of humanity, and we didn't really understand it deeply. For example, Maria Regina Pacis was bombed and the priests had to flee Turin and lived here in View. Father Fogliati and his confreres lived here and waited until it was over. And these events really shocked the youth. The world really changed. Young people saw atrocities, really major atrocities. Since then, we have been a humanity that suffers. Perhaps we needed to change the way we do things. Perhaps it was not immediately understood. I was struck by reading the journals of Chiavari students who, at the beginning, when they talked about the war, they said things like, "Let's go outside and watch the fireworks over Genoa." But it was the bombing of Genoa. Then, when they saw nearby places that had been bombed, like Lavagna and Rapallo, and went to see the debris, or sometimes when going to the beach they would see bodies floating in the water, men from the Italian submarines hit by enemy planes. They saw the dead, and then they understood that it was not just a nice time watching fireworks. They saw atrocities, and there was a worsening of humanity, whereas before there was a more naive youth, a humanity that was more naive and more open to the good. After the Second World War, I believe that Europe experienced an enormous shock, and then people became much more reserved, less open to hope, no longer naive, but in a good way, perhaps with more malice, and this environment did not favor the flowering of a vocation. Quite simply, it changed the world completely. For the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, it was important to find new strategies that took into consideration that humanity was wounded. It was becoming more and more problematic.